Before we dive in, if you love epic tales of war, strategy, hit that subscribe and like button, turn on notifications, and join our growing legion of warriors. Now, let's begin. They thought they knew war. They thought they understood strategy, endurance, and the long, drawn-out struggles that defined interstellar conflicts. But they had never faced humanity. Not like this. For as long as the Galactic Accord had existed, war had been a slow, methodical process. Empires and coalitions would wage conflicts that spanned decades, even centuries. War was not about swift victories. It was about patience, attrition, and carefully orchestrated maneuvers that exhausted an enemy before utterly breaking them. That was the Accord's way. To them, war was a siege, not a battle. A game of endurance, not brute force. So, when they declared war on humanity, they expected the same familiar patterns to unfold. They saw humans as an annoyance, a race that had expanded far too quickly, challenging the old order, refusing to bow to the Galactic Accord's authority. From the Accord's perspective, humanity's rise had been reckless, aggressive, and dangerous. They had claimed uninhabited worlds at an unprecedented rate, built military installations along trade routes, and refused to pay the levies that all lesser civilizations were expected to pay to the ruling powers. To the Accord, war was simply the natural consequence of humanity's defiance. A swift but controlled war. A measured response to human insolence. A war that would last decades, perhaps even a century, as humanity was gradually weakened, until they inevitably surrendered and became another obedient vassal state within the Accord. That was the plan. Accord's war councils predicted that within the first 10 years of the conflict, humanity's supply lines would collapse under economic pressure. Their fleets, outnumbered and technologically inferior, would struggle against the overwhelming force of the Accord's combined navies. In 20 years, major human colonies would be blockaded. By year 50, Earth itself would fall. The Accord had planned for every possible scenario, or so they thought. What they didn't plan for was what happened next. The war did not last decades. It did not last years. It barely lasted days. The first engagement was meant to be a show of force, a mere introduction to war. For Accord, assembled a massive fleet at the edge of human space, a demonstration of power that would instill fear and ensure compliance. Over 500 warships, including dreadnoughts that had shattered entire civilizations in past wars, pushed into human-claimed space. The fleet commanders expected resistance, but they were confident. Humanity had never faced the full might of the Accord before. The first fleet vanished. No distress signals, no signs of battle, no wreckage returning to Accord-controlled space. Just silence. At first, the Accord thought it was a communications failure. A navigational error, perhaps. Then, as time dragged on, dread began to set in. A reconnaissance squadron was dispatched to investigate. What they found defied every expectation. The debris fields were clean, too clean. Normally, the aftermath of a space battle was a chaotic mess. Twisted hulls, shattered escape pods, fragments of ships floating in the void. But this was obliteration. The wreckage wasn't just destroyed. It was molecularly disintegrated. The hulls of their most powerful warships were burned straight through, as if struck by a force beyond comprehension. Even the largest battleships, vessels that had withstood nuclear bombardments in past conflicts, had been erased from existence. There were no survivors, no distress beacons, no black boxes transmitting final logs. The only remnants of the fleet were fragmented husks, drifting lifelessly in the void, stripped of energy signatures, stripped of life. Panic spread through the Accord's high command. In their long history, the Accord had fought hundreds of wars, crushed countless civilizations, absorbed entire species into their empire. They had always been the stronger power. Always the conquerors, never the conquered. But this was something else. They weren't fighting a desperate species clinging to survival. They weren't facing an enemy that would crumble under pressure. They were facing something else entirely. Desperate to regain control of the situation, the Accord assembled a second fleet, this time twice the size of the first. A force of over 1,000 warships, led by their most powerful flagships. They mobilized the best tacticians, The most experienced admirals, the most advanced AI warfare systems at their disposal. They still had no idea what they were up against. The Second Fleet moved cautiously, pushing deeper into human-claimed space. Their sensors were at maximum range, their shields at full power. They sent out long-range probes, scanning for any sign of the enemy. At first, nothing. Then, they detected something. A single human vessel, small, almost insignificant in size compared to the Accord's warships. It drifted alone in the darkness, motionless, unarmed, completely unprotected. A scout ship? A decoy? It made no sense. The Accord's fleet commander ordered an analysis. Before the scans could be completed, something impossible happened. That lone human vessel spoke to them. A single transmission. Just one. A message carried across the vastness of space, delivered in a calm, almost casual voice. You shouldn't have come here. Then, in an instant, the darkness of space ignited in an explosion of light and fire. The explosion wasn't a weapon, not in the traditional sense. It wasn't a missile, a torpedo, or a directed energy strike. It was something far worse. The moment. The first Accord warship locked its targeting systems onto the lone human vessel. The very fabric of space seemed to shudder. A ripple of energy spread outward like a shockwave, but not one made of fire or concussive force. It was something deeper, something that violated the very physics the Accord thought they understood. For precisely 3.2 seconds, every sensor across the 1,000-ship fleet failed simultaneously. Their quantum systems scrambled, their AIs flickered into incoherence, and the very laws of nature seemed to buckle beneath an unseen weight. Then, just as suddenly, their systems returned. But the battlefield had changed. The lone human vessel was gone. In its place, hell had arrived. The Accord fleet had been confident. They had mobilized 1,000 warships, each one armed with cutting-edge weaponry, shields that could withstand the most devastating barrages, and armor designed to endure even the harshest battles. They had never, in their long history, been outmatched. Now, they were surrounded. In an instant, space itself was filled with human warships. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. But that wasn't what terrified the Accord commanders the most. It was their silence. Humanity did not announce their presence with a fleet-wide transmission. They did not demand surrender, issue ultimatums, or even mock their enemies. They simply arrived, materializing out of the void like wraiths from the abyss. No warp trails, no hyperspace distortions, no warning. The Accord's flagship, the dreadnought Vothran's Judgment, immediately transmitted an emergency distress call to the homeworld. The message was simple. They are everywhere. Before it could send a second transmission, the human fleet opened fire. But not in the way the Accord expected. They had fought many space battles before. They understood kinetic bombardments, plasma torpedoes, and high-energy beam weapons. They had entire doctrines built around countering such attacks. But this was annihilation. The first human volley didn't just destroy the lead Accord battleships, it erased them. It wasn't a matter of firepower. The Accord had seen powerful weapons before. No. This was something different, something that shouldn't have been possible. The human weapons didn't just impact the Accord's shields, they bypassed them entirely. One moment, the Accord's frontline warships were whole, shields at full power, weapons charged. The next, they were gone. Not damaged, not crippled, gone. A 1,000-meter-long cruiser was there one moment, and the next, only a cloud of superheated vapor remained. No debris, no escape pods, nothing but a residual energy signature that defied all known physics. The Accord fleet, the most powerful armada ever assembled against a single enemy, was being torn apart. And they still had no idea how. The admiral of the Second Fleet, a seasoned veteran who had orchestrated the downfall of entire species, tried to regain control. All ships, defensive formation Omega-7, full counterfire, deploy interdiction fields. It didn't matter. The moment their ships began to maneuver, humanity responded with something even worse. The Accord fleet never even saw the retaliation coming. At first, it appeared as if the human ships weren't moving. They remained still, locked in their ominous positions, as if they had no need to dodge, no need to reposition for advantage. But then, the Accord's second wave of warships, over 300 vessels, simply ceased to exist. There was no energy discharge, no impact, no explosion. One moment, those ships were there. The next, they weren't. The Accord's admirals screamed for answers. Their tactical AIs scanned desperately for any sign of what was happening. But the data made no sense. According to their sensors, the missing ships had never been there to begin with. It was as if time itself had been rewritten, as if those vessels had been erased from history. Panic spread through the remaining fleet. Veteran officers, hardened by centuries of warfare, were breaking down, unable to process what they were witnessing. War was supposed to be predictable. No matter how powerful an enemy was, there were rules, strategies that could be countered, weapons that could be analyzed, weaknesses that could be exploited. But this was not war. This was execution. The Accord's remaining ships, still numbering in the hundreds, broke formation. Their instincts, their training, everything they had ever learned told them one thing: run. But it was already too late. Humanity had not come to defeat them. Humanity had come to end them. The Accord fleet tried to flee. But fleeing wasn't an option. Not anymore. Their ships fired up their jump drives, emergency protocols overriding all safety checks. They didn't care about trajectory calculations or gravitational distortions. Anything was better than staying. But as their engines roared to life, nothing happened. The Accord couldn't move. Not because their engines had failed, or because their drives had been disabled. No. It was something far worse. Something no war doctrine had ever prepared them for. Space itself was holding them in place. Accord scientists had long studied the concept of gravity manipulation, but even their most advanced technology could only create localized distortions, affecting missiles, bending light, slowing incoming projectiles. But this was something beyond their comprehension. Across the fleet, sensors screamed warnings. Something was wrong with space. The very fabric of the battlefield had changed. It wasn't just that the Accord ships couldn't escape. They couldn't even move. Not forward, not backward, not at all. The flagship, Vothran's Judgment, sent another desperate transmission to command, trying to explain the situation. But the response they received was chilling. You are still in formation. The Accord commanders reeled in shock. That wasn't possible. They had been maneuvering for battle. Ships had repositioned, flanked, spread out. But according to Central Command, the fleet had never moved at all. It was as if time itself had frozen them in place. And then, the human fleet moved. For the first time since their silent arrival, the vessels shifted forward. But they didn't accelerate. They didn't fire engines or distort space around them. They glided. Like shadows sliding across the void, they drifted toward the immobilized Accord fleet, with a slowness that was somehow more terrifying than a full-speed charge. The distance between them shrank in an instant, and yet their motion seemed unnatural, as if the very concept of distance was meaningless to them. And then, the whispers began. At first it was dismissed as system interference, AI glitches, static leaking through communications. But then the voices grew clearer. They weren't random. They were speaking in Accord dialects. One by one, across every ship in the fleet, the Accord heard them. Soft voices, cold, devoid of emotion. You fired first. You sought war. You sought conquest. You will have neither. Terror gripped the Accord officers as they realized something even more horrifying. These voices weren't coming from any known transmission frequency. They were inside their minds. Fleet Admiral Corvex, a hardened veteran of countless wars, gritted his teeth as he fought against the panic rising in his chest. He turned to his bridge officers. "Shut it out! Focus on weapons! Fire!" But as his gunnery officers tried to comply, something impossible happened. Their weapons were already fired, not disabled, not jammed. They had been expended. Their entire fleet's arsenal had been emptied. Every torpedo launched, every energy cell drained, every kinetic round spent, without a single shot ever leaving their ships. They hadn't even felt it, hadn't seen it happen. Their ships had been silently disarmed before they even realized what was happening. And now, Now, the human ships were right in front of them. The Accord had always viewed humans as just another primitive species, perhaps adaptable, perhaps stubborn, but ultimately just another in a long line of conquests. But the ships before them, they weren't made for war. They were made for annihilation. Their hulls were featureless, black as the void itself, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. No insignias, no identification markers, no weapon ports visible, just looming, silent behemoths that should not exist. Corvex took a shaky breath. His people had always believed war was about superiority, more ships, better weapons, superior tactics. But this wasn't war. This was judgment. Across the fleet, Accord officers, trained warriors who had fought across the stars, began to break. Some slumped in their chairs, unable to move. Others ripped off their communication headsets, clawing at their own temples as if they could tear the voices from their minds. Corvex slammed his fist onto the console, his vision blurring with fury. "We are the Accord! We do not surrender!" The voices responded. Surrender? For the first time there was emotion in their tone. It was amusement, a hollow, mocking laugh that echoed through the minds of every single Accord soldier. You think surrender is an option? Across the battlefield, human ships shifted. They didn't fire. They didn't need to. One by one, Accord vessels vanished. No explosions, no wreckage, no screams, just gone. Entire warships, some the size of cities, erased from existence as if they had never been there at all. Corvex felt the blood drain from his body as he watched his armada, his mighty, invincible fleet, fade away like dust in the wind. This wasn't war. This was extermination. The last thing he saw before, his flagship Vothran's Judgment, disappeared into nothingness, was a single human vessel remaining in the void. Silent. Watching. As if it had never moved at all. Corvex's consciousness strained against the overwhelming force pressing down on it. His thoughts felt sluggish, his body disconnected, his very existence teetering on the edge of oblivion. He had fought in over 100 campaigns. He had razed entire colonies to ash, conquered worlds in the name of the Accord, and broken enemies so thoroughly that their civilizations never recovered. And yet, in all his years of war, he had never felt fear like this. This was not the fear of death. This was the fear of erasure, not just of his body, but of everything. His fleet, his people, his history. It was as if the universe itself was being rewritten to exclude them. He blinked, and suddenly, he was somewhere else. The cold metal deck of his command bridge was gone. The familiar hum of ship engines, the overlapping chatter of his officers, the rhythmic beeping of consoles, all gone. Instead, he stood in a void, a vast, featureless expanse, a deep, endless blackness that stretched beyond sight, beyond comprehension. Yet, it was not empty. They were there, the humans, not as ships, not as soldiers, not as flesh and blood, as presence. Vast, immeasurable, infinite. Their voices were no longer whispers crawling through his mind. Now, they were everywhere. You thought, this was war. The words didn't come from a direction. They came from all directions. From within him, around him, through him. He gritted his teeth. The Accord does not yield to fear. A silence stretched between them. A silence that was not absence but pressure, and then amusement. Fear? No, this is not fear. The blackness around him shifted, and suddenly Corvex saw something impossible. The Accord's homeworld, floating before him, as if he stood in the depths of space itself. His world, Vothkal, a jewel of industry and military power, a world that had forged empires through conquest. From orbit, he could see its sprawling megacities, its fortress continents, the glimmering reflections of orbital shipyards. And then, it began to change. Not in an instant, not with an explosion, not with destruction, but with absence. The cities did not crumble. They simply ceased to be. Skyscrapers vanished mid-air. Ships disappeared mid-flight. Whole populations, billions of souls, faded like dust caught in a silent breeze. Even the oceans weren't spared. The waters did not evaporate. They simply stopped existing. In mere moments, the vibrant, thriving world of Vothkal had become a dead rock, stripped of its atmosphere, its life, its meaning. It had been unmade. Korvax fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wanted to scream, to demand an answer, to deny what he was seeing. But even as he tried to summon rage, he knew, deep in the core of his being, that this was real, that the humans had done this with a thought. Your war is over. The voice was final. No anger, no hatred, no cruelty, only certainty. Korvax squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to speak. Why? His voice cracked, and he hated himself for it. Why are you doing this? What are you? For a moment, the darkness seemed to pulse. And then, he was back, aboard his ship. His command crew was still there, still frozen in place, their expressions locked in the same terror they had worn before everything went black. And outside his ship, the battlefield remained, his fleet intact, his homeworld still out there. Nothing had changed, except him, because he knew. He had seen what the humans could do, he had felt it. And if they were letting him return to this moment, it was not mercy. It was a message, a single, unspoken truth now etched into the core of his soul. They had already won. The war had ended before it had even begun. The humans had simply chosen to let them understand why. He took a shuddering breath and opened a fleet-wide channel. Every surviving Accord officer looked to him, awaiting orders. There was only one order left to give: stand down. The silence that followed was long, heavy. And then, across the fleet, weapon systems powered down, shields lowered, engines cut to idle. The war, one the Accord had been certain would last decades, had ended. Not in battle, not in diplomacy, but in acknowledgement. For the first time in their history, the Accord had encountered something they could not fight, could not conquer, could not even comprehend. And they knew, without a shadow of doubt, that they never would. Because the humans were not warriors. They were something far, far worse. They were gods. The silence aboard the flagship was suffocating. Korvax's order still echoed across the fleet, words that had never before been spoken in the history of the Accord's military. Stand down. Somewhere, deep in his mind, a part of him still fought against it. The part that had been trained, since birth, to believe in the Accord's superiority, in the unquestionable power of its war machine. The Accord did not retreat. The Accord did not surrender. The Accord conquered. And yet, at this moment, none of that mattered. He had seen what the humans truly were, or rather, he had seen only a glimpse, and that glimpse had been enough to bring the entire war effort to its knees. Across the fleet, officers and commanders hesitated, waiting for clarification. Surely he had misspoken. Surely there had been a mistake. The battle had just begun. How could it already be over? A transmission request blinked on his display. His second-in-command, Varshan, was requesting a private channel. Korvax accepted, and the view screen flickered to life, revealing Varshan's tense, disbelieving expression. Supreme Commander, Varshan began, his voice controlled, but laced with barely contained urgency. With respect, we have the numbers. We have the firepower. Why are we surrendering? Korvax exhaled slowly, his gaze dark and hollow. Because we never had a war to begin with. Varshan's mandibles twitched. That makes no sense. We still have functioning warships. Our weapons mean nothing. Korvax's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. Varshan faltered. His commander was not a coward. He was not weak. If Korvax was saying this, it meant something terrible had happened. Korvax took a deep breath before continuing. I saw it, Varshan. I saw them. Not as warriors. Not as an enemy. As something greater. Something beyond our understanding. His voice dropped to a whisper. I saw our homeworld erased as if it had never existed. Varshan stiffened, his breath catching. Erased? Not destroyed, not conquered, unmade. They rewrote reality itself, and for a moment, for a brief, agonizing moment, They let me understand what it meant. Varshan swallowed hard, his spines flaring. And then? Korvex's gaze darkened. And then they put it back. Silence. Varshan struggled to process what he was hearing. The implications were too vast, too horrifying. If the humans could do what Korvex claimed, then this wasn't war. This was a lesson, a demonstration of power beyond reason, beyond technology, beyond anything the Accord could ever hope to resist. Varshan's claws tightened into fists. He had never felt helpless before. Never. But now he understood. The Accord's vast fleet, its centuries of conquest, its unshakable belief in its own supremacy, none of it mattered. Not against them. Korvex could see the moment his second-in-command grasped the full reality of the situation. The shift in his posture. The way his shoulders sagged ever so slightly. The realization that the war was over, because it had never been a war at all. Varshan let out a slow breath. Understood, Supreme Commander. He didn't argue. He didn't question. He simply accepted. Across the bridge, Korvex's officers had been listening. Though they had not seen what he had seen, they had witnessed something just as terrifying. Their Supreme Commander, a warrior who had never known fear, standing before them, changed. That alone was enough. One by one, the fleet's officers issued the same. Command, stand down. And then, something happened that had never before been recorded in the history of the Accord. The Supreme Commander of the largest, most powerful military force in the galaxy sent a message to the enemy. A message of submission. Korvex's hands were steady as he typed out the words. To the Human War Council, we yield. The Accord recognizes the impossibility of victory and seeks no further conflict. This war ends now. The message was sent. A tense silence fell across the fleet as they waited for a response. Seconds passed, then minutes, and then, without fanfare, without grand proclamations, without a single shot fired, the human ships vanished, not through hyperspace, not through any known form of travel. They were simply gone, as if they had never been there at all. A message appeared on Korvex's screen, acknowledged. Nothing more. No gloating, no demands. Just a single simple confirmation. The war was over. Korvex closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. He had expected destruction. He had expected retaliation. Instead, the humans had simply left. Not because they had forgiven the Accord, not because they respected them, but because the Accord had never mattered in the first place. Korvex felt something cold settle in his chest. It was one thing to lose a war. It was another to realize that, in the eyes of the victors, the war had never even been worth fighting. And for the first time in his life, the Supreme Commander of the Accord felt something he had never known before. Not just fear, but insignificance. A deep, unshakable certainty that the universe was far, far greater than he had ever imagined, and that the Accord was nothing more than a footnote in its history. Korvex stood at the command deck of his flagship, staring at the empty void where the human fleet had once been. His claws trembled, an involuntary reaction he could not suppress. The war was over. No, that wasn't quite right. The war had never truly begun. The officers on the bridge were silent. No one spoke. No one dared to. It was as if a storm had just passed, yet the devastation it left behind was not physical. It was something deeper, something that clung to their very souls. Varshan finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse. What do we do now? Korvex did not answer immediately. The truth was, he didn't know. He had been Supreme Commander of the Accord's military for over 3 decades. He had led hundreds of campaigns. He had crushed rebellious worlds. He had seen civilizations rise and fall at the Accord's command. But now, the Accord had been dismissed, not defeated, not even subjugated. Dismissed. The realization settled over him like a suffocating weight. Every lesson, every strategy, every doctrine he had ever learned, none of it applied anymore. A new era had begun, and the Accord was no longer a player in the game. Slowly, Corvex turned to face his officers. "We return home." Varshan frowned. "And what do we tell them?" That was the true question, wasn't it? How do you tell an empire that has never known submission? That it has just come face to face with something it cannot even begin to comprehend? How do you tell them that their vast fleets, their powerful armies, their entire way of life, all of it, meant nothing in the face of a force so absolute that it had chosen mercy over annihilation? Corvex's mandibles tightened. We tell them the truth. It was the only answer that mattered. The journey back to Accord space was silent. The fleet, once proud and invincible, now drifted like a shattered ghost of its former self. No battle cries, no celebratory messages, no triumphant return. Only silence. Word spread quickly. The officers whispered among themselves, and soon, the entire fleet knew what had happened. They had seen it. The humans had done something no enemy had ever done before. They had forced the Accord to surrender without firing a single shot. When the fleet finally arrived at the capital world of Akrazon, the mood was grim. Billions of citizens awaited them, expecting a victorious return. Corvex could see it in their faces. The expectation of a hard-fought war, of stories of battle and glory. They had no idea. As Corvex disembarked, he was met by the High Council. The Chancellor, a towering figure with gleaming ceremonial armor, stepped forward. His tone was impatient. "What news of the humans? Have they been crushed?" Corvex did not bow. He did not kneel. He simply stared into the Chancellor's eyes and spoke the words that would change the course of the Accord forever. "The war is over. We surrendered." A hush fell over the gathered officials, a stunned silence that stretched long and heavy. Then, outrage. Council members erupted in protest. Some accused Corvex of cowardice, of treason. Others demanded to know how an empire as mighty as the Accord could possibly lose so quickly. Corvex raised a hand, and the hall fell silent. His next words were measured, deliberate. "We did not lose." He let the weight of the statement settle before continuing. "To lose a war, you must first be considered a worthy opponent." Confusion rippled through the council. The Chancellor narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Corvex exhaled slowly, then spoke with the clarity of a man who had glimpsed something far greater than himself. "The humans are not what we believe them to be. They are not simply another empire, another species to conquer. They are beyond us. Beyond the Accord, beyond anything we have ever encountered. They did not defeat us. They chose to let us live." The words struck like a physical blow. The Chancellor scoffed. "This is nonsense. You expect us to believe that these primitive creatures—" Corvex cut him off. "They are not primitive. They have technology we cannot understand. Power we cannot measure. They did not fight us because they had no need to." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the council. For the first time, they listened. Corvex continued. "They erased a planet from existence, Chancellor. They did not destroy it. They removed it. And then, in an instant, they put it back." His voice dropped. "Do you understand what that means?" Silence. The Chancellor's expression darkened. He turned to the gathered council members, but none spoke. Because deep down, they knew. The Supreme Commander did not lie. The Accord had never faced an enemy it could not defeat. Until now. Corvex stepped forward, his voice firm. "If we fight them again, we will not be given a second chance." The Chancellor clenched his jaw. "So, what do you propose?" Corvex took a deep breath. "We do what no Accord leader has ever done before." A pause. "We adapt." The words carried a weight that filled the entire chamber. The Accord had never adapted. It had never needed to. It had been the dominant force in the galaxy for centuries. But now, that era was over. The council did not argue. They did not protest, because for the first time in their history, they were truly afraid. Afraid of what lurked beyond the stars, afraid of what humanity truly was, and most of all, afraid of what humanity could become. The weight of history had never felt heavier. The High Council chamber, once the heart of the Accord's absolute power, now stood silent as Corvex's words hung in the air like a death sentence. The Chancellor's mandibles twitched. his body rigid with disbelief. Adapt? You suggest that we, us, the greatest empire in the galaxy, bend the knee to these creatures? Korvex's gaze did not waver. No. I suggest we survive. The council chamber erupted into a storm of voices, arguments, outrage, denial. Some of the oldest and most powerful members of the Accord's leadership refused to accept what they had just heard. The Accord had ruled through power, through dominance. The idea of stepping back, of yielding, was unthinkable. But it was not impossible. Korvex remained still, watching. He knew they would resist. He had spent his entire life as a warrior of the Accord, and he understood its leaders better than anyone. They would fight against this truth not because they believed he was wrong, but because they feared he was right. The Chancellor's fists clenched, his body trembling with barely contained rage. We are the Accord. We are the galaxy's rulers. And you dare stand here and tell us we must bow to humans? Korvex's voice was calm but unyielding. They did not ask us to bow. The room stilled. They did not demand our surrender. They did not take our planets. They did not even require our compliance. They simply showed us what they could do. And then they left. The truth was undeniable. There was no war to fight, no demands to resist, no enemy to strategize against, because to the humans, the Accord was not an enemy, it was an irrelevance, and that was the true horror of it all. For centuries, the Accord had believed itself the apex predator of the galaxy, the singular force that dictated the rules of war and conquest. But now the humans had revealed a truth more terrifying than annihilation. The Accord was not powerful. It had never been. Compared to humanity, it was nothing more than an insect, noticed only because the humans had chosen to look down. The Chancellor's voice was quieter now, but still defiant. And what do you propose we do, Korvex? Beg for their mercy. Korvex met his gaze steadily. We prepare for the future. We change. A ripple of unease passed through the council. The word itself, change, was nearly forbidden. Within the Accord's rigid, ancient hierarchy, change was weakness, change was uncertainty. But now, change was the only path left. Korvex continued. The humans did not wipe us out because they did not see us as a threat. But one day, that might change. One day, we may cross a line that we cannot return from. And on that day, if we are not prepared, we will be erased from existence without a second thought. His words struck deep. For the first time, the council members truly listened. The Chancellor exhaled slowly. And if we prepare, if we change, what then? Korvex did not smile. There was no victory. In this, no triumph. Only a grim understanding of the road ahead. Then perhaps, one day when humanity looks down at us again, they will not see an insect. Another silence. Then at last, the Chancellor nodded. It was slow, reluctant, painful, but it was acceptance. The Accord would not fight. Not now. Perhaps never again. Because the war they had expected, the war that should have lasted years, decades, centuries, had ended in mere days, and humanity had chosen to walk away. As Korvex left the council chamber, he gazed up at the night sky. Somewhere, beyond the stars, the humans continued their advance into the unknown. And for the first time in his life, Korvex understood what it truly meant to be at the mercy of something greater. The future was uncertain. The Accord's time as the galaxy's dominant force was over. But perhaps, just perhaps, this was not the end. It was only the beginning.